Hello guys. If you like our content and you love scary stories, then subscribe, like, and write in the comments your scary stories so that we write your story. Scary viewing and terrifying sensations to you. The Silent Room, The Haunting of the Hawthorne Manor. Part 1. The Move to Hawthorne Manor. When the McAllister family inherited Hawthorne Manor from a distant relative they had never met, it seemed like a blessing in disguise. Moving from the cramped apartment in the city to a sprawling estate in the countryside felt like the perfect escape from their hectic life. The manor stood at the end of a long, winding road, surrounded by dense, ancient woods. Its tall, spindly towers and shadowed windows gave it an aura of mystery that was both inviting and slightly unsettling. The day they arrived, the sky was a heavy gray, casting a gloomy pallor over the landscape. Michael, the father, tried to shake off the feeling of dread creeping up his spine as he guided the car up the gravel driveway. Sarah, his wife, was more optimistic, marveling at the sheer size and beauty of the estate, while their two children, Emily and Jack, seemed eager to explore. Inside, the manor was a maze of narrow hallways and grand rooms filled with the echoes of lives long past. Dusty portraits lined the walls, their eyes seemingly following the family as they moved through the house. The air was thick with the scent of aged wood and something else, a faint, unpleasant odor that none of them could quite place. As they began unpacking, the strange feeling only grew stronger. Michael noticed that the rooms, despite their grandeur, felt oddly cold, as though the fireplaces hadn't been used in years. Emily and Jack, who had been exploring the upper floors, came running back, their faces pale. "Dad, we found a locked door upstairs," Emily said breathlessly. "We tried to open it, but it wouldn't budge." Michael exchanged a glance with Sarah. "Well, old houses like this have lots of secrets," he said, trying to sound cheerful. "We'll see if we can find a key later." But as night fell and the shadows lengthened, the manor took on a different character. The creaks and groans of the old house became more pronounced, echoing through the halls like whispers. The family settled in for their first night, hoping that a good night's sleep would make everything seem less eerie in the morning. As they lay in bed, Michael and Sarah heard it for the first time, a soft, rhythmic tapping, like someone gently knocking on the walls. At first, they dismissed it as the house settling, but as the night wore on, the tapping grew louder, more insistent, moving from one wall to the next, as if something was moving through the walls of the manor. When morning came, the family was tired but eager to explore more of the house. They decided to search for the key to the locked door Emily and Jack had found. After an hour of rummaging through drawers and cabinets, they finally discovered an old, rusted key hidden in a dusty bureau in the study. The key fit the lock perfectly, but as they turned it, the door creaked open with a noise that sent chills down their spines. The room beyond was unlike any other in the house, small, windowless, and filled with an oppressive darkness. There were no furnishings, just a single chair in the center of the room, facing the door. "What is this place?" Sarah whispered, her voice barely audible. Michael stepped in cautiously, the air suddenly feeling much colder. "I don't know," he said, frowning, "but I don't like it." Just as he turned to leave, the door slammed shut behind them with a force that shook the walls. The family jumped, their hearts racing. When Michael tried to open it again, it was stuck, as though something was holding it closed from the other side. From within the darkness, a low, guttural whisper emerged, sending a shiver down their spines. "Welcome to Hawthorne Manor," it said, the voice barely more than a breath, but filled with malice. Part 2. The room's secrets unveiled. The door eventually gave way, and the family stumbled out, shaken but unharmed. Michael insisted they must have just been spooked by the old house and a stiff breeze, but Sarah wasn't so sure. She couldn't shake the feeling that they had disturbed something best left alone. As the days passed, The manor seemed to come alive in ways the family could not explain. Footsteps echoed in the halls at night, even though everyone was accounted for. Shadows moved where no light should have been. The oppressive atmosphere of the locked room seemed to seep out, infecting the rest of the house with its malevolence. Emily was the first to notice the drawings. She found them in the corners of rooms, behind doors, and even on the backs of picture frames. At first, they were small, almost innocuous childlike scribbles of faces and eyes. But they grew more detailed and unsettling, depicting twisted, contorted figures and scenes of anguish. One evening, as Sarah was preparing dinner, she heard a soft humming from the hallway. It was a nursery rhyme, one she used to sing to Emily and Jack when they were little. She followed the sound, her heart pounding, until she reached the foot of the stairs. The humming stopped abruptly, and all she heard was the creak of the floorboards above her. "Emily?" "Jack," she called, trying to keep her voice steady. There was no response. She climbed the stairs, feeling a cold draft wrap around her. The hallway was empty, but the door to the locked room was ajar. It creaked open slowly as she approached, revealing the dark, empty space inside. Sarah Michaels' voice called from downstairs, startling her. She turned quickly, her pulse racing. "Up here," she replied, relieved to hear him. But when she turned back to the room, she saw it. A figure, barely visible in the darkness, sitting in the chair. Its head was tilted, as though it were watching her, and she felt an overwhelming sense of dread wash over her. She backed away slowly, not daring to look away until she was safely back in the hallway. The door to the room slammed shut on its own, the sound echoing through the house. "What happened?" Michael asked as he reached her, seeing the fear on her face. "There's something in there," she whispered, clutching his arm. "I saw it, Michael. I swear I saw it." Michael didn't want to believe her, but the fear in her eyes was real. That night he stayed up listening to the house, trying to convince himself that it was all in their heads. But as the hours passed, the whispering returned, louder and closer, until it felt like it was right outside their bedroom door. Part 3. The diary in the walls. Determined to find some rational explanation, Michael spent the next day exploring the manor more thoroughly. In the library, he stumbled upon a false panel in one of the walls. Inside, he found an old, dusty diary. The leather was cracked, and the pages were yellowed with age, but the handwriting was surprisingly clear. The diary belonged to a woman named Eliza Hawthorne, who had lived in the manor over a century ago. As he read, Michael felt a growing sense of unease. Eliza wrote of strange happenings in the house, of voices and shadows, and of a child who had gone missing, only to reappear in the locked room, forever changed. Eliza's words painted a picture of a house haunted by its past, cursed by something ancient and malevolent that had claimed the room as its own. She wrote of rituals and sacrifices, of desperate attempts to appease whatever dwelled there. But nothing worked, and the room grew darker, more sinister, consuming all who dared to enter. Michael's hands shook as he read the final entry. Eliza spoke of hearing the whispers herself, of seeing shadows move in the corner of her vision. She had locked the room, hoping to contain the darkness, but it was too late. The last lines were barely legible, scrawled in a frantic hand. "It is watching. Always watching. We are never alone." He put the diary down, his mind racing. Could it be true? Could the manor really be haunted by something so evil? He didn't want to believe it, but too many things had happened that he couldn't explain. That night, he shared the diary with Sarah. She read in silence, her face growing paler with each page. When she finished, she looked up at him, her eyes wide with fear. "We have to leave," she said, her voice trembling. "We can't stay here, Michael. Not after this." But as they spoke, a soft knock echoed through the room. They froze, the sound unmistakable. It came again, more insistent this time, coming from the walls themselves. "It's in the walls," Michael whispered, horror dawning on him. "It's in the walls." Part 4. The Night of the Scratches. The atmosphere in the manor grew heavier, more oppressive. Every breath felt thick with tension, and the walls seemed to close in around the family. Despite Sarah's pleas to leave, Michael insisted they stay if only to figure out what was happening. Emily and Jack were oblivious to the sinister history Michael had uncovered in Eliza Hawthorne's diary, but their behavior had shifted in small, unsettling ways. Jack, once cheerful and full of energy, had become withdrawn. He spent hours staring at the walls, muttering under his breath. Emily, on the other hand, seemed to have grown an unhealthy fascination with the locked room. She asked about it constantly, wanting to know what was inside, what they had seen, and when they would go back. One night, as the family sat together in the living room, trying to relax after another tense day, they heard it. The sound came again, scratching. This time it wasn't just in the walls. It was everywhere. The soft, grating sound of nails against wood, growing louder and more frantic. The walls trembled as if something was trying to claw its way out. Sarah clutched Michael's arm. "We have to go now," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the eerie noise. Before he could respond, the lights flickered and went out, plunging the room into darkness. Panic set in as the scratching grew deafening. It seemed to come from all directions, closing in on them. "Jack!" Emily, Michael shouted, struggling to find his way to his children in the pitch-black room. A soft giggle echoed through the darkness, followed by a child's voice. "Come play with us, Daddy." It was Emily's voice, but it didn't sound right. It was distant, hollow, as though it were being spoken by someone or something else. Michael's heart raced as he fumbled for his phone to use as a flashlight. When he finally illuminated the room, his blood ran cold. Jack and Emily stood at the foot of the stairs, their faces blank, staring straight ahead. Behind them, barely visible in the dim light, a shadowy figure stood hunched over. Its long, skeletal fingers rested on the children's shoulders, its face obscured by darkness. "Get away from them," Michael shouted, rushing forward. But as he did, the figure vanished, leaving only the scratching sound echoing through the house. The children blinked as if coming out of a trance and looked at their parents with confusion. "Dad," Jack asked, his voice small. "What's happening?" Michael didn't answer. He grabbed the children and pulled them into the living room with Sarah, who was shaking with fear. The scratching stopped as abruptly as it had started. But the silence that followed was even more unnerving. It was as though the house was holding its breath, waiting for something terrible to happen. "We're leaving first thing in the morning," Michael said, his voice firm. He no longer cared about understanding the haunting. All he wanted was to get his family out of Hawthorne Manor before it was too late. But as the night wore on, it became clear that the manor had no intention of letting them go so easily. Part 5. The Basement. The basement. At midnight, a strange, heavy thud echoed from the basement. Michael and Sarah, wide awake and tense, exchanged glances. They had avoided going down there since they moved in, partly out of fear and partly because it had felt unnecessary. But now, with the eerie thud repeating, it felt as though the house itself was beckoning them down into its depths. Arming himself with a flashlight and a crowbar, Michael slowly descended the creaky staircase, with Sarah close behind. The air grew colder with each step, and a strange, acrid smell hit them as they reached the bottom, a smell like decaying wood mixed with something far worse. The basement was vast and cluttered with old furniture covered in dusty sheets, stacks of broken crates, and long-forgotten relics of the past. But the thudding sound drew them to a far corner, where the shadows seemed unnaturally thick. As Michael approached, the beam of his flashlight flickered, casting long, ominous shapes across the stone walls. There, partially hidden behind a large pile of old trunks, was a trapdoor, its wood warped with age. The thudding was louder now, as though something was trapped beneath. "Michael, don't," Sarah whispered, clutching his arm. But curiosity, or perhaps the same malevolent force that had plagued the family, drove him forward. He pried open the rusted latch and lifted the door, revealing a set of narrow stone steps descending into pitch-black darkness. For a moment, neither of them moved. The silence that followed was suffocating, as if whatever had been making the noise was now waiting for them below. The air that rose from the trapdoor was ice-cold, carrying with it the unmistakable stench of death. "We have to see what's down there," Michael said, though his voice trembled. He knew that whatever lay beneath was the heart of the manor's evil. Sarah wanted to protest, but before she could, a soft voice echoed from the darkness below, faint but unmistakable. "Help me." It was a child's voice. Without thinking, Michael began to descend the stairs, the flashlight barely piercing the inky blackness. Sarah followed reluctantly, her heart hammering in her chest. As they reached the bottom, the beam of light flickered and died, plunging them into total darkness. But just before the light went out, Michael had seen something, a figure crouched in the corner, its face twisted in an expression of pure agony. The child's voice came again, closer now. "Help me." And then the scratching started again, this time louder and more frantic than before, as though the walls themselves were alive, trying to tear the family apart from within. Part 6. The Children's Drawings. The darkness in the basement was so complete that Michael and Sarah couldn't even see their hands in front of their faces. The air felt thick, almost tangible, like it was pressing down on them, suffocating them. "Michael, we need to get out of here," Sarah whispered, her voice barely more than a breath. Her instincts screamed at her to run, to take the children and flee the house immediately. But something in Michael wouldn't let him leave. He was drawn deeper into the basement, even though every fiber of his being told him it was dangerous. The faint child's voice echoed again, but this time it was distorted, wrong no longer pleading for help, but mocking them. Suddenly, the flashlight flickered back to life, casting a faint, weak beam that barely illuminated the space around them. The figure Michael had seen before was gone, replaced by a chilling silence that seemed to pulsate with malice. "We have to go," Michael said, finally breaking out of his trance. They hurried back up the stone steps, slamming the trapdoor behind them. As they reached the top of the basement stairs, they heard it again, a child's laugh, but it was high-pitched and cruel, echoing from behind the door. When they reached the living room, they found Emily and Jack sitting together, eerily quiet. In front of them, on the floor, were sheets of paper covered in dark, frantic scribbles. "What's this?" Michael asked, his voice cracking with unease. Emily looked up at him, her face blank. "We drew pictures of the man," she said in a monotone voice, as though she were in a trance. Jack didn't say anything. His wide eyes stared at the pictures on the floor, his small hands shaking. Michael picked up one of the drawings, and a chill ran down his spine. The figure the children had drawn was disturbingly familiar, the same hunched figure he had seen in the basement, with long, twisted limbs and hollow, empty eyes. Another drawing depicted the manor itself, but in flames, with shadowy figures surrounding it, watching as it burned. "Who told you to draw these?" Sarah asked, her voice trembling. "The man in the walls," Emily replied, her tone still emotionless. "He told us we needed to." The air grew colder as the family stared at the unsettling drawings. The manor seemed to creak in response, as though it was acknowledging that they were no longer alone. Something had been awakened in Hawthorne Manor, something ancient, malevolent, and determined to claim them. Part 7. The Disappearance. The oppressive atmosphere of Hawthorne Manor had reached a boiling point. Every night seemed worse than the last, with the temperature dropping to unnatural lows and strange noises echoing through the house, scratching, tapping, and an eerie humming that seemed to come from within the walls themselves. But nothing could have prepared them for what happened next. It was a cold, stormy night when the nightmare escalated beyond control. Michael and Sarah had gone to bed, exhausted from the constant tension that seemed to grip the house. Jack and Emily had both been unusually quiet during the day, their normally playful and energetic selves reduced to sullen, distant children. They refused to talk about the strange drawings, and every time Michael or Sarah brought up the figure in the basement, the children's eyes glazed over, as if they didn't remember what they had drawn. As the wind howled outside, rattling the windows, Michael and Sarah were jolted awake by the sound of Emily screaming. It wasn't just a cry of fear, it was a blood-curdling scream, the kind that makes your heart stop and fills you with primal terror. Sarah yelled, leaping out of bed. Michael followed close behind, his heart pounding as they ran down the hallway toward Emily's room. When they reached the door, it was locked from the inside. "Emily." "Open the door," Michael shouted, pounding on the wood. There was no response, just the continuing sound of her screams, muffled now but still gut-wrenching. Desperation took over, and Michael rammed his shoulder against the door. After several attempts, the lock gave way, and the door flew open. Inside the room, their worst fears were realized. Emily was nowhere to be found. Her bed was empty, the covers tossed aside as if she had been ripped from her sleep. But what terrified Michael and Sarah the most were the claw marks gouged deep into the floor, leading toward the window. The window itself was wide open, curtains flapping wildly in the wind. It was as though something or someone had dragged Emily out of the house. Sarah screamed, rushing to the window and leaning out, looking down into the darkness. But there was nothing, no sign of Emily, no sign of anything at all. Michael grabbed a flashlight and raced outside into the storm, frantically searching the grounds for any sign of his daughter. He called her name over and over, but only the wind answered him, carrying his desperate cries into the night. Back in the house, Sarah was on her knees in Emily's room, sobbing uncontrollably. Jack stood in the doorway, his face pale and expressionless. He didn't cry, didn't speak. He just stared at the empty bed where his sister had been. Hours passed, but there was no sign of Emily. As dawn broke, the hopelessness began to set in. Michael and Sarah were shattered. Their daughter was gone, and they had no idea where or how. The police arrived, but their search yielded nothing. No footprints, no clues, just the horrifying reality that Emily had disappeared without a trace. But deep down, Michael and Sarah knew that whatever had taken Emily wasn't something the police could stop. Part 8. The Descent. In the days following Emily's disappearance, the atmosphere in the house grew darker. It wasn't just the overwhelming grief and fear, it was as though the very air inside the manor was thicker, heavier, filled with a malevolent presence that seemed to be watching, waiting. Michael threw himself into searching for answers, desperate to find any clue that could lead him to his daughter. He spent hours reading through old records, newspapers, and anything he could find on the house and its former occupants. The more he uncovered, the more horrific the truth became. Hawthorne Manor had a long and dark history. Over the centuries, several families had lived there, but none had stayed long. There were stories of strange disappearances, children vanishing without a trace, and sightings of shadowy figures that haunted the halls at night. But the most disturbing of all was the legend of Eliza Hawthorne, the original owner of the house. Eliza was said to have been a reclusive woman, deeply involved in dark rituals and the occult. According to the records Michael found, she had lost her own children under mysterious circumstances and had become obsessed with finding a way to bring them back. It was rumored that she had made a pact with something evil, something ancient, in exchange for her children's return. But the children never came back. Instead, over the years, other children began to disappear, first from the town, then from the manor itself. It was as though the house had become a vessel for whatever malevolent force Eliza had summoned, and it was hungry for more souls. Michael shared his findings with Sarah, but she was too consumed by grief to fully comprehend the horror of what he had uncovered. She refused to believe that their daughter was gone forever, clinging to the hope that Emily would somehow return. But Michael wasn't so sure. Late one night, as he pored over the ancient texts he had found in the manor's library, he came across a passage that chilled him to the core. It described a ritual, a way to communicate with the spirits trapped in the house. Desperate and out of options, Michael knew he had to try it. He couldn't sit idly by while his daughter was lost to whatever haunted Hawthorne Manor. The ritual required him to go to the basement, the place where the strange occurrences seemed to center. Armed with nothing but a candle and the instructions from the ancient text, Michael descended into the darkness once again. As he lit the candle and began the incantation, the temperature dropped even further, and the shadows in the corners of the room seemed to shift and writhe. The air was thick with a sense of impending doom, and the house seemed to groan and creak in response to his words. Suddenly, the candle flickered and went out, plunging the basement into darkness. Michael's heart raced as the air grew still. Then, from the darkness, a voice, Emily's voice, whispered his name. "Daddy." It was faint, but unmistakable. He called out to her, pleading for her to come back, to tell him where she was. But the only response was a soft, mocking laugh, a laugh that didn't belong to his daughter. The basement grew colder, and the walls began to vibrate with the now familiar sound of scratching. The shadows closed in, and Michael realized with a growing sense of dread that he wasn't alone. The ritual had worked, but it hadn't brought Emily back. Instead, it had awakened something far worse. Part 9. The Return. The days blurred together after Michael's attempt at the ritual. He was consumed with guilt, convinced that whatever he had done in the basement had only made things worse. Sarah barely spoke to him, her grief having turned into a hollow shell of her former self. Jack, who had once been so lively, now wandered the halls in a daze, whispering to someone only he could see. But then, one night, everything changed. It started with a knock on the door, soft, hesitant, but unmistakable. Michael, who had been sitting in the living room, jumped to his feet. His heart raced as he crossed the room and opened the door, his breath catching in his throat. Standing there, shivering in the cold night air, was Emily. Her clothes were dirty, her hair tangled, and her eyes distant, but it was her. His daughter had returned. Michael's first instinct was to pull her into his arms, to hold her and never let go. But something stopped him. There was something off about Emily, something he couldn't quite put his finger on. "Daddy," she whispered, her voice flat and emotionless. "I'm home." Tears welled up in Michael's eyes as he knelt down and hugged her, but as he did, he felt a coldness radiating from her skin, a coldness that wasn't natural. Part 10. The Final Truth. Michael held onto Emily tightly, but the icy chill radiating from her made him uneasy. Something was terribly wrong, but his heart refused to accept it. After all the despair, the fear, and the endless nights spent searching for answers, his daughter had returned. How could he question that? He brought her inside, wrapping her in blankets and calling for Sarah. When Sarah saw Emily, her reaction was a mixture of shock and relief, but there was something in her eyes, a flicker of doubt. Michael noticed it immediately but said nothing. They sat Emily down by the fire, bombarding her with questions, desperate to know where she had been and what had happened. But Emily offered no answers. She simply sat there, staring into the flames, her once lively eyes now cold and distant. Her responses to their questions were short, vague, and emotionless. She didn't remember anything where she had gone, how she had gotten back, or even how long she had been missing. Every time Michael or Sarah pressed her for more details, she would just shake her head and mutter, "I'm home now." That night, as the family tried to settle back into some semblance of normalcy, strange things began to happen again. The scratching returned, louder and more insistent than ever before. Doors opened and closed on their own, and the cold spots in the house seemed to follow them no matter where they went. But now, the worst of it seemed to center around Emily. Whenever she was in her room, the temperature dropped even lower. Lights flickered, and the walls groaned with an unsettling frequency. Michael began to notice subtle changes in his daughter's behavior. She no longer ate or slept. She would sit in her room for hours, staring at the walls or drawing strange symbols in the dust on the floor. Jack, who had been so close to Emily, refused to go near her. He would watch her from a distance, his face pale with fear, but whenever Michael or Sarah asked him what was wrong, he would shake his head and say, "She's not Emily." At first they dismissed it as the ramblings of a frightened child, but soon Sarah began to feel the same unease. One night, she confided in Michael that she had been hearing voices Emily's voice, calling to her from the darkness, even when Emily was asleep. The voices would whisper strange things, telling Sarah that something terrible was coming. The turning point came one night when Michael woke up to the sound of whispering. He turned over in bed, expecting to see Sarah, but her side of the bed was empty. Panic surged through him as he realized the whispers were coming from downstairs. He got up and cautiously made his way down the creaking stairs, following the soft murmurs into the living room. There, in the dim glow of the fireplace, sat Emily. She was crouched on the floor, her back to him, and beside her was Sarah, sitting unnaturally still, her eyes wide and unblinking. Emily was whispering something into her mother's ear, her voice barely audible, but the words were strange, guttural, and inhuman, like a language Michael had never heard before. "Sarah," Michael called out, his voice trembling. Sarah didn't respond. Emily turned slowly, and when she did, Michael's heart nearly stopped. Her eyes were not her own. They were black, bottomless voids that seemed to absorb the light from the room. A twisted smile spread across her face, one that sent a chill through Michael's bones. "Daddy," she said, her voice echoing with something far darker than a child's. "It's too late." Before Michael could react, the air in the room grew impossibly cold, and a force stronger than anything he had ever felt knocked him backward. He hit the floor hard, the wind knocked out of him as the lights in the house flickered and went out. The only illumination came from the dying embers of the fire, casting eerie shadows across the room. Sarah's body twitched, her head lolling to the side as though she were a puppet on strings. She rose from the floor in jerky, unnatural movements, her face devoid of expression. Michael tried to stand, but an invisible weight pressed him down, making it impossible to move. Emily, if it was still Emily, stood over him, her dark eyes gleaming with a malevolent energy. "We've been waiting," she whispered, her voice no longer her own. "You opened the door, and now we are here." The realization hit Michael like a tidal wave. Whatever he had summoned during the ritual, whatever dark force he had unleashed, had taken his daughter. And now, it was claiming them all. In a final act of desperation, Michael screamed for Sarah, but she was gone, her body nothing more than a shell, moving under the control of something far more sinister. The shadows in the room writhed and twisted, taking on shapes and forms that made no sense, as if the very fabric of reality was unraveling around them. Emily's voice, no, the voice of the thing that had taken her, was the last thing Michael heard as the darkness closed in. "You should have left it hissed." But now, You belong to us." The shadow swallowed him whole, and Hawthorne Manor fell silent once more. Our epilogue. The house stood abandoned, a silent sentinel over the horrors that had unfolded within its walls. The locals whispered about the family that had moved in and vanished without a trace, leaving nothing behind but unanswered questions and a house full of shadows. No one dared go near Hawthorne Manor anymore. The children in the village would tell stories about the strange lights that sometimes flickered in the windows, or the faint sounds of whispering that carried on the wind at night. But no one ever set foot inside. The legend of Hawthorne Manor grew with each passing year, but one thing remained certain: the house was cursed, and those who entered never came back. Some said the family was still there, trapped in the shadows, their voices lost in the endless night. Others believed that the thing that had taken them was still waiting, watching, hungry for more souls to claim. But no one ever went close enough to find out.